With Jerry Payne, Jerry McCarthy. Today is August 30th, 1997, and let's get started. First off, what division were you in?
I was in the 12th Armored Division.
Okay. And when were you born and where?
I was born in New York City in 1926.
And what were your parents like? Tell me a little bit about your father.
My father, he I don't have enough to hook onto. Maybe we can.
Do you mind?
Zip it and put it on. Oh, my.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
As long as the technician is okay with him.
Okay, let's start again. Tell me a little bit about your father.
Well, he was a veteran of World War I, and he was not in the same sector that I eventually wound up in. He was in the service when he was 18 years old, and when he came home, he worked for Ford Motor Company for a while, and then in Kearny, New Jersey, and then eventually he became a New York City fireman and retired 22 years I think it was of service. At that time he had, in a fire, he had a serious happening with one of his eyes, and he was blind in one eye actually when he passed away. From what I understand, as a younger man, he was a pretty good ball player. He was born and brought up in Lower Manhattan, New York, and in the same locale. My mother came from the same locale, as far as that's concerned, and her father was a letter carrier at that time. My father's father was a New York City policeman, going back in the 1800s, late 1800s, and so forth. He never retired. He retired from the police force, but then same week almost, he became a court officer and worked until he was about 74 years of age, and he worked for within 1 week of when he died. My mother's father worked in the post office for 42 years until they forced him out of the post office. He was 70 years old, I believe. And my mother, I don't remember, any particular thing. She had as much schooling as people could have in those days coming along. She worked at a number of different jobs, one of them being for the Loft Candy Company, and she was handled the routine for the executive lunch dining room there for the boss, for the president of the company, for a while. And then as my brother came along and I came along, he settled down to run a home and see that we were kept under control and educated and so forth. She had a pretty good singing voice. She used to sing from grade school time, and in the parish that they lived in, they always put on musical shows and so forth. She then projected herself out, to forward about her talent, in that she did get a couple of requests if she was interested in doing this to be pushed along, but she didn't. But anyway, she was a homemaker, and saw that we were taken care of growing up as kids.
just the two of you?
Yeah, I have an older brother. He's still alive.
What did your father think of, what was his thoughts on the World War I?
We never talked about it. I never heard him talk about it. He never sat down with me. There are some other aspects of that situation where he wasn't around. So we weren't close, let's put it that way, and leave it that way.
Okay. Was your brother involved in World War II?
Yes, he was, near the tail end of it. He went into service late, in that he had a deferment, in college. And actually, by the time he took his basic training and arrived overseas, it was the end of the war. But he had been in a number of bases in the country before he went over, and after he came back. He had been around in more places than I had been, as far as installations, Army installations were concerned. And then he was discharged before I was. Came in after I did and discharged before.
So how was he involved? Where was he at?
Oh, I guess he spent most of his time in Germany, and a bit of the occupation period. I've been trying to think of. He was in small towns, but I think one of them, like being near Frankfurt, Germany, and he had an administrative type job, and I don't know. He did utilize his off time to see the historic things in Brussels, as he told me. That was one of his trips. They were day trippers then, I'd say, and I've forgotten what else. You remember him telling me? But I know that he was a student, and he was interested in history. He already knew a lot. He could speak French. He could speak German, and Italian, for that matter. And he could go to certain places, like the colleges or a parish, and talk to a priest in his own language and so forth, and find out, He knew where he was. I mean, from his previous studies, when he was in a country, he knew exactly like where he wanted to go, and he knew where he was and what he wanted to see there. He was that type of person. He became a teacher, came home, taught philosophy in Seton Hall University for a while, and then when he settled in Levittown, Long Island, he became chairman of the English department for the high school. And he had received his master's degree in Romance languages from Fordham University, and he did study his doctorate for a while. But the burden was too much. He was, getting older as all this was going on, and it was too much going on in his life at one time. But he did get pretty much down the road on it. Too bad. Other than that, I don't think I can tell you too much about him. Otherwise, we always got along, if you want to put it that way, as far as family, we're always there, for one another.
So what education did you have before the war?
Not much. I was 18, and I left high school before I graduated. And I still had to complete it when I came home. But in a way, you might say that I was afraid I wasn't going to get into this. I wasn't going to get to the war. And of course, being 18 at that time, we naturally had a lot of reports in the newspapers. We pretty much knew what was going on in a big picture way in the Pacific and in Europe, and what had gone on. I mean, from the original attack by Germany, on France and on Poland and so forth. I mean, I knew pretty much of that when back in 41, 42, and 43. I was. I mean, I don't know if anybody else around me was, but in school we didn't particularly sit around and discuss it. I don't remember the teachers discussing it either, on a daily basis, except that we should keep our eye on the goal as far as being a student, and not to worry too much, about the world situation. But most of my buddies that were 16, some 17, with their parents' permission, and some parents were very happy to sign them on, were gone, into the Marine Corps. A lot of them were gone in the Navy. I wasn't able to get into either or, nor was I going to be signed in. But I used to go down to the Navy recruiting office every once in a while, when they would say, just turn me around and push me out again, They just weren't, they really weren't taking people just because they said they wanted to go at 17, So when it came up for the Army, there was no problem. I mean, I turned 18, I went down and told them I want to go, and they said okay. And I was in. So if you want me to tell you where I started, was called Camp Upton, Long Island. And that today is the National Laboratory, the atomic laboratory. That's where the cyclotrons are and so forth. The physicists from all over the world are there. Well, that was a reception camp, and from there, after a week or 10 days, you were shipped off. In my case, it was shipped off to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and I had an interesting job, though. I mean, the first part of Camp Upton, by keeping my mouth shut, that I wasn't a carpenter, and I wasn't a plumber, and I had no administrative training, and any other particular type of craft. I just stood there and I didn't open my mouth. As the sergeant said, "Who is?" and those people were assigned to some of the most ridiculous jobs, in the world. So when it got down to whoever was left, and I was one of them, and he said, "Well, okay, we got a job down in the bank for you." So you report to the bank, at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I'm on Camp Upton. I know where north, east, south, and west is, but I don't know where the buildings are or anything else. But you report there as if I was an old timer, hanging out, waiting for an assignment. But I went down to the orderly room and I looked at the local map on the board and so forth, and then I walked over to the bank, and then I walked over to there, and I sat down in a small lobby, and eventually a sergeant showed up, and most of the people there at that particular time were Air Force veterans. They had been over. A lot of them had been wounded, and they had administrative type jobs mostly, in handling the operation of the base. Of course, that was Army Air Force. You know, it was all one family as far as branches of service are concerned at that time. And he said, "What can I do for you?" I said, "I don't know, Sergeant sent me down here." I'm still in civilian clothing. I haven't been issued a uniform yet. And I got a big tag hanging down my front here that says who I am, so I won't forget, and where I belong. I didn't know what the area was, but I mean, it probably had, you know, like B84-something or other. If anybody found me, at least they could, you know, call up the local dog pound, you know, and send me home. But he said, "Yeah, you're okay." He said, "You're supposed to have an assignment down here, right?" And he says, "Well, I tell you what. I'll get a duster. You can dust the shelving off, sweep the floor, and polish the water cooler." And he says, "Have coffee. And when you're finished," he said, "just let me know you're going." So I said, "Fine." So I read the newspaper for a while. It was out there in the lobby, and then I cleaned everything off that didn't need cleaning because it was all polished and everything, you know. The water cooler looked great. And I left about 10 o'clock in the morning. And I took myself a walk around Camp Upton. And I watched the ball teams playing, and seeing people standing on line you know, outside of buildings and things like that. I just walked around. Nice sunny day. And eventually I went back to the area where I was assigned to, because I figured that's where the mess hall was and I'd get something to eat. And the next morning I went back to the bank again, you know, and dusted the shelves. Swept off the floor. It was still spotless. And I don't know whether it was the third or the fourth morning, the first sergeant said, "Today," he said, "you're going to be a messenger." Okay? There's a report to building so-and-so, which was the unit orderly room. And finally, I got a big envelope, and it said, "Take this up to post headquarters." And I said, "Sure. Where is it?" So, "Oh, okay, that's right. You wouldn't know where post headquarters is." I said, "No." "Well, let's go outside." And when I went outside, I said, "Take this bike." It was a big balloon tire bike, and had a big basket on the front, and I put the material in the basket, and I was beginning to point this direction, and then you go that direction, and so forth, and I took off. And this bike was a real dud because you could hardly pump it, you know. But I worked it out, and I found my way up to the headquarters and walked up, and there was somebody up there that was doing the receiving, and I gave it the thing, and they punched in the time on it and said, "We have nothing going back." So I went out and I got my bike, and I walked alongside of the bike, and I went down and I watched the ball games that were going. Ball games used to be going on all times. There was softball or hardball or whatever, and people standing outside of buildings in line. And eventually I got myself back at lunchtime, you know, to go to a mess hall. And I did that, I think, for 2 days. And then they wanted to do something with us as a group, and that was to issue uniform. And then we finally received suntans. And of course the rumor went around right away, "Gee, they're going to issue you suntans here. That might mean you're going to go out to the Pacific." Well, I said, "It's August and it's hot. and the Army wears suntans in August when it's hot, at least. But the suntans, were no bargain. They kept, a lot of the heat in, I think. And so you had a uniform and a pair of boots. We wore the high type shoes. They were made by Endicott and Johnson. They were really fine shoes. And I think we received some fatigue uniforms at that time. And was getting close now to begin to give us more orientation. And then they said we were going down to take the general service tests. Sat through 5 hours, I believe, of that. And I think maybe as a following day, we were taken down to the medical people, and they gave us the World Series of shots. Where this is where some people don't survive. They fall out the front door and down the steps. And I didn't have any problem with that. But that night in the barracks, I remember somebody having a very bad reaction to the whole thing, and they had to cart him away. And the tough part about that is, everybody was sleeping, and then this fellow was banging his head off the wall and yelling and screaming and so forth, and they got somebody to take him away. I never did get back to the bank. I never did get back to being a messenger again, because they finally decided that we were going to be shipped off to Fort Dix. And at Fort Dix, actually is more reception, indoctrination. And then I think we went to Fort Meade, Maryland. And at Fort Meade, there was more issuing of clothing. That's where the stenciling party went on, where you stenciled your name and your serial number on your all your web equipment, on your duffel bag, and counted, and it was recounted in the barracks. The barracks had like twice as many men, bunked than it was actually called for. That was another funny thing. When they assigned you to KP, they would tie a white towel, around the end of your bed, and they had double-decker beds, and they had beds though down the aisle. That's how crowded it was. But I had a single bed down the aisle, and about maybe it was 5 o'clock in the morning, somebody came into the barracks and said, "Okay, up and at 'em, let's go." And I said, "I don't have to get up and at 'em, and let's go." And the fella came back, down, and he said, "I said up and at 'em, let's go here." I said, "I am not on the KP list." And with that, he picked up the end of the bed, and he was about to dump me when I jumped out of the bed and picked it up and threw it at him. And I said, "Is there a white towel on the end of that bed?" And he said, "No." He says, "That is a mistake." This guy was a corporal, but he had an awful lot of power in those days. When they entered, your presence and so forth, you genuflected. So he said, "No, that is a mistake." And I said, "I don't appreciate getting thrown out of bed." I said, "When I don't have to." And I said, "I really don't like to throw things at people either." He said, he laughed. He says, "Okay, you're okay." So I wasn't picked for KP after that. Maybe because, alphabetical order, and they passed over me for whatever reason or something. I don't know. But that was, an amusing incident, that happened. And then, we were constantly inventorying, your socks and your shirts and stenciling and God knows what. They showed you how to make a bed, how to put the army corners, hospital corners in, and so forth. And this was done, at all hours. I mean, it just seemed to go on and on and on, And then finally, they said, okay, it looks like everything is pretty well up to snuff, so there'll be passes issued on this particular afternoon, late afternoon. There would be passes issued. You could go to Washington, D.C., or go to Baltimore, Maryland, provided that your hair was cut. And it had to be cut short. Now, they weren't cutting hair short themselves. They weren't coming in, like you see the pictures in the routine pictures over the year. Everybody seems to be going through and being sheared, No, that didn't happen. Not in my case, or anybody that I was with at that time. But I had to make sure that the hair was short enough for the first sergeant's, satisfaction. So a fellow I met from Oyster Bay, Long Island, we became sort of buddy-buddy. And I said, well, there's only one thing we can do, Ed. You cut my hair and I'll cut yours. Make sure. So we cut one another's hair, and then his cousin was with him also. So we made a round of cutting hair that afternoon, and it was short enough, and we got a pass. So we went to Baltimore, out the back gate, and went downtown and went to a place that was serving steak. And it was the first, what you would say, good meal, in a while. I had no problem with what was being served. I mean, already, there was no problem with that. And then we were shipped to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and there we were issued weapons, the M1 rifle, and we weren't issued ammunition or anything like that, but we got the weapons, and then we were only there maybe 2 days, and that's all they did, because Kilmer was now the final staging area. There was no turning back, as it was. And at this point, we're going to be sent off, to training areas. So they eventually got us down to the railhead, and I was shipped off to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for my infantry basic training. There was another indicator there that this was infantry. So it meant that's where you're going. It looked pretty good. And at my time of entering the service, there wasn't much need, for training ordnance or engineers or signal, what we used to call all the spare part branches, because they needed infantrymen. And there was not much hope, You were either going to go to a tank school. Very few people went to Fort Sill, Oklahoma for artillery. And the infantry training bases were loaded with people just for that purpose, to turn them out every, 4 months. They would turn out thousands of people. I mean, basic riflemen. But you were trained in, the 30 caliber machine gun. You were trained in a mortar You were trained with a bazooka. You were trained with a BAR, and then of course all the other tactical aspects of handling that with sections and squads and so forth. And I think it was about maybe 3 weeks into training at the most, I was made an acting sergeant. We used to call them acting gadgets. And they put 3 stripes on my arm, and I was treated as if I was a full-time NCO, which meant that I didn't have to pull details excepting Sergeant of the Guard. That's different. But I didn't have to do KP, for instance. And there was table waiter, was another one. The table waiters, used to wake up just as early as the KP people because they had to go down to a distribution point to get the ice for the mess hall and get the milk. The milk was delivered in, tall containers. What are they? Steel, aluminum or stainless steel, containers. And you took a big wagon and pushed it down to pick this up and bring it back, and waiting on tables meant that you would just get the dishes for the table, or you had to line up things on the plates and the cups and the nice forks and spoons and all that on the table in the mess hall. And the way that was done, because they had to be absolutely straight, X number of inches from the corner of the table and the space in between, and there was 4 people on each side of the table. So one individual would get down the far end of the mess hall and hold the string, and you took the string back, and it was taut absolutely on that string, and would cut the top of the cup right even. And then the knife, fork, and spoon was put out and so forth. And then you had to do all that, and if there was a ketchup or mustard or things like that, the condiments, other condiments, that's on the table. So when the inspecting officer came in, he could look right down that line and see if everything was ship-shape. And well, I had to pull that once, and the second time it came around, this was before I was made an acting sergeant. When it came around the second time, I gave $5 to somebody else, and he pulled it for me. So I had a day off then in camp because the first sergeant thought I was on detail. But I was actually there, and another guy was pulling my detail for $5. Of course, I might have been doing something else, which I did later on for $1, even after I was made a squad sergeant actually. So occasionally, for $1 or $2, I'd press fatigues. So. And then you started off September, October, November into December, basic training. It was finally completed, and the Battle of the Bulge was raging in Europe, and actually our training had been cut, I think, by 2 weeks almost when that happened, because they were calling for people to leave the country and start filling the units in Europe. And of course we weren't happy to see the headlines, that things going downhill, and here we go, we're ready. And there was no turning back. I would say that the training was top-notch. It was very thorough. I was treated well. Treating it, like you understood. You didn't have to be taken by the hand and so forth. You were well led by the cadremen. And my experience seemed to be a heck of a lot better than I heard stories of others or those who preceded us in 1943 and 1942. But the infantry replacement training camps all had the same doctrine to go by. The officers were very good. And actually we didn't see those people very often because they had a massive training staff, the teachers, instructors. So they people assigned of authority to a company were mainly administrative, to see that you got to where you were supposed to go, and then there was always somebody else, to take over and put you through. We went through some pretty rough training if you were not in shape when you started. I mean, you would be when you finished it, but it was a heck of a lot better. And I was in very good shape when I started. I mean, I could, handle the weight of my body, which was maybe 160 some odd pounds at that time. I went through all the physical things with no problem whatsoever. And I had no problem on the 25-mile march. In fact, I carried, in addition to my own weight, I carried the weight of two other weapons because some of our fellows were having a problem, and we didn't want anybody to drop out, so we tried to ease up on their weight because we were carrying full packs and everything. And we went up over a mountain in Alabama. It's called Baines Gap, and that was part of the 25 miles, and that was about 8 hours. And we were marching from maybe 8 o'clock in the evening until I don't know. We pulled in maybe about 2 o'clock in the morning, somewheres around there. And as far as I'm saying, for your morale, when we came into our immediate area in cantonment, the mess sergeant had something for us to eat, coffee and cake and so forth, and then they were going to let us off then until 10 o'clock the next morning. And that was big, that was really something, in playing physical exercising and training would happen a number of times during a day, because before breakfast they would take you down to the blacktop, and with your M1 and full pack or light pack, combat pack or whatever, and you would start running around the perimeter of that blacktop until they figured you had enough. And then you would come back and have breakfast, and you had breakfast in about between a half hour and 45 minutes. That's what they gave you. So it was really in and out of the mess hall and back. And of course, you had to remember not to mess up. I lived in a hut, what they call a 6-man hut. I didn't live in a big barrack like a lot of other people did in different camps. They had them at McClellan, but where my training company was assigned to what they call 6-man huts. So when you left, everything was in ship shape, the floors, and these weren't easy places to maintain. So you had to be careful. In fact, we got to the point where only one individual out of the 6 would go into the hut and get something for somebody else, so there wouldn't be too much tracking. And I had the job of checking 2 other huts where the men in the platoon, men in my squad, were sleeping, because I had to check their bunks to see that it was A-OK. And before we left, because when you came back, if the bunks weren't up to snuff, there were gigs. The bunk would be ripped apart and things like that. Fortunately, I had worked it out with my people, that this did not happen. And they used to crawl around, underneath. The huts were up on cinder block, and they would crawl around underneath the hut, to see if there was any dirt and things like that. Some clowns that smoked, would put the cigarette through a knothole in the floor, and of course that wound up on the ground under the hut, and that was a no-no. And the matches went down there, and it's the same as some people would put the Coke bottle up in the rafter, where you could reach down. There was like a little shelf, you see, and the roof came this way, and there was a space up there that, for whatever reason, they couldn't put the Coke bottle someplace else, or I don't know about beer cans then, but I had to go up and I had to reach around in there to see if, old socks or whatever was up there. That had to be cleaned out, because when the inspecting officer came through, he got up on a foot locker and he looked in through there. So there was only one time that I thought maybe we weren't going to make it, but we were well into the training cycle, and we were running a little bit behind this morning because maybe a night problem, and we didn't have much sleep, and by the time we got up and got moving around, the time to fall out the formation of the day and be take off, there was going to be an inspection before we left. So the guys were rushing around and were trying to do the best that they could and so forth, but I looked around and I said, boy, I don't think we're really going to make the standards this morning. And I said, however, I have an idea. Knowing the platoon leader, the second lieutenant, just knowing a little bit about what I felt the type of an individual he was. Number one, I knew that he liked music, and he liked people in show business, and he played the guitar. Didn't play it for us, but I found out these things, And I had a friend that worked for 20th Century Fox at the time in New York City, a fellow I went to high school with, and he sent me all the glossy shots, publicity shots from the studios in Hollywood of all the starlets, all the big stars, pinups, And I had these, under my mattress, because it was a long, thin cotton, like that. And I said, you got to agree with me, but this is what we're going to do to get this guy's mind off, a real strict inspection this morning. I said, we're going to put these up. The guy said, well, you're not allowed to put them up. I said, did you hear me? He said, you got to go with me, not against me. I said, put one up there and one up there, and put one on the pillow of your bed and so forth. So we spread them around on the 6 beds. And when he came in, I brought them to attention, and he started looking around, and he said, who owns these? I said, I do. He says, who do you know? Oh, I said, I have a contact. I have friends in 20th Century Fox. And he says, woo. He said, I'll be back. And he flew out the door and he went up the street, and I could hear him boom-a-da-boom-a-da-boom, you know, double timing his inspections up the street, and he comes flying back, and he comes in and he sits down in the bunk, and I have about 100 and some odd of these glossy shots. And he's looking through, and of course there are some doubles there, and I said, you want one or two? I said, you can have it. I can? I said, yeah, you can have it. I have doubles. I said, if I need more, I said, I'll make contact New York City and I'll send them down. Oh, he says, gee, that would be great. So I said, just help yourself. So we did, and he thanked us and so forth, and he left. So it was the end of that, you know, day of inspection, no gigs, so forth. So then we, whatever the training day was, we went out about our business.
What training did you feel was really helpful over in the war?
Well, actually, it was learning, you know, to take care of yourself and how to work with a group. In my case, I was expected to automatically be able to lead 12 people, and I had an assistant squad leader. But I had to learn and apply leadership right away, and take care of them. You know, I had to see, you know, that their uniforms and their web equipment and everything was clean, and they turned out, you know, to my satisfaction, let alone the cadre satisfaction. In addition, too, because when you were appointed, see, there were four squads, and there was a platoon leader. So in each platoon, you had, you know, 4, 8, 12 temporary appointments, and so we took additional training at nighttime, so we could be ahead of our own people, you know, on the weapon that was going to be taught tomorrow. So I fell into that sort of thing. I don't know why. It could be one possibility when they went through the records and found that in high school I helped the coach the track team. I mean, after I had left my freshman year, and I indicated to my health ed, you know, coach, if I could be of assistance and so forth, and he said, sure. He says, what I would like you to do, you know, was in the spring, he says, start working with the freshmen when they come on the team. And of course that went on my record. And of course when they asked me, the same as you asked me, the questions and so forth, they said, I put that down. So the only thing I can figure is that made us show, you know, some leadership. And where were we?
Training.
Yeah, but you had to become proficient, you know, in all of the equipment, you know, all the weapons, you know, to be utilized, because you didn't know what combination you were going to wind up with eventually. And then I wound up, I think, in a rather unique situation, being trained as a foot infantry, as we used to call it, you know, the old foot pounder, in an armored division. When I went overseas, I was assigned to an armored division. I mean, I hadn't associated, you know, with all the vehicles and all the equipment on the vehicles and so forth, and how they functioned. But, you know, you just kept learning. You know, you just listened, you know, to what was going on. And of course, the platoon leader and the platoon sergeant and your squad sergeant and so forth, we're all doing the same thing. You know, take care of you, train, teach you, and so forth. So that was no problem. I mean, you had to keep your eyes and your ears open. I mean, if you were going to, if it was going to help you, that's the only way it could help you. I mean, maybe to survive. So I had no problem with that. You know, I wasn't thinking about anything else except doing the job, being able to do a job, and not get into trouble because I didn't know or I wasn't paying attention. Yeah, I would say that.
Let's see, from Dixon, where did you go?
From Fort Dix?
From Dix, right.
Fort Dix, I went overseas on a Queen Elizabeth. 4 days and some odd hours. I had a nice trip. I had good quarters in comparison to some other people.
Did you get sick?
No. See, that's what I mean. I didn't get sick. And it just was no big deal. I mean, as far as that's concerned, I mean, it wandered all over the ship, pretty much, except the upper decks, which were off limits. But I was on A deck. In peacetime, it was a suite of rooms. We had a lot of people in there, though, 6 high, and maybe 21 people in one room and 20 some odd people in the other room. And we had a full bathroom, and of course, most of the people were sick in the room, so they were up in their bunk and their equipment was on the floor. And I put my equipment in the bunk and spent the rest of my time wandering around the ship. Or I slept in the hall, slept in a lobby, and there were people doing this all over, the ship. There were people sleeping on PX lines because you could buy, candy and tobacco and so forth. It was like a regular PX, but it would only be open so many hours. So I didn't spend any time on a line. A buddy and myself, we made up a list of what we wanted. Wasn't a heck of a lot, but I mean, it was just having something extra in your pack. And then we paid another guy to stay on the line. And then they issued Coca-Cola on the house to each room, each location. I don't know how they, where they had the list and all that other stuff, but somebody came in the room and said, if you follow me, and we'll go down, and get the Coke. So before we left, we asked the people in the room if they wanted their Coke. And most of the people in the room were sick. And when they heard, Coke, a lot of them, it had an effect on them, and in the next room, no, they don't want any Coke or anything. It didn't bother to ask the guys that were playing cards in the bathroom if they wanted, because they had the door shut. There was 3 card games going on in the bed, one in the tub, three guys standing by the sink, and they used to just put a cardboard down or a newspaper or a magazine or something, for a top, and then there was one guy at each end of the tub and one sitting on the floor outside. And wherever there was space, there were people playing cards. Literally, we didn't bother with them. So we went out, this friend of mine, and we were taken down the aft end of the ship, and we went down in an elevator, and they issued 2 cartons of Coke. So we promptly took it up, I don't know, the first deck, where there were troops above the supply level decks, in the ship, and we put it out in the hall and we sold it for 50 cents a bottle. So then we could go up on I think it was back up on the A deck, and went back to the stern of the ship. And in peacetime, there obviously had been some sort of a lounge. And in the lounge, they were selling some beer. Like, I don't know, 25 cents, or something for the beer in those days, you know. So we bought some beer. And finally we arrived in Glasgow, Scotland, and incidentally the ship zigzagged all the way across. There was a tremendous storm, I think, on the second night out, where the waves were breaking over the promenade deck, and the ship was just, you know, going like that, nice and easy, you know. There was about 85,000 tons of ship there. So we arrived safe and sound in Glasgow, Scotland, and they put us on trains, and they took us to Southampton, England. And that was a good 24-hour trip at that time. The trains had been used, reused. They were, you know, broken windows, and there were compartments, you know, but there were so many people on the train, and everybody with the same amount of equipment, with the duffel bag and the barracks bag and the full pack and the overcoat and the weapon and steel helmet, you know, and everything. You carried everything, you know, all your belongings in the world with you, right? And there were people trying to sleep on the floor. It was, you know, a sit-up type of thing, you know, European cars, you know, that with the compartments, and of course the doors were always open. I don't remember them, maybe if they were still there, but a lot of the glass was broken out of the windows, and it was pretty cold out. You know, the train was cold. There was no light, you know, and I don't think they. Well, I can remember stopping when it was still daylight. I've forgotten whether they fed us or not. But at one station, they had, I don't know, Gray Ladies or Red Cross or a combination, and they were out there with donuts and tea. They had big buckets of tea. I don't remember coffee. Well, by the time we left, we had taken a couple of trays of the donuts with us as we pulled out of the station, and they were pretty upset over that as the train was moving and we were saying goodbye, and they were yelling, "You can't take the trees," and we said, "Yeah, fine, thanks a lot, we'll see you again." And we pulled out, and we had all these extra donuts then, you know. And the people were, some areas where we passed through, they had apartment houses, you know, that were still standing, and people were hanging out from the different floors, and they were yelling, and I guess whatever, Yankee, you know, blah, blah, blah. And we were yelling back the same to you, and hi there, you know. And finally we got to Southampton. And at Southampton they had an old rust bucket waiting for us to take us across the channel. And I don't know how many ships they had, because this one ship couldn't handle all of the people that came down on that train. And there was no bunks. You just went down. It was a cargo ship, and you just went down. I think there were 3 or 4 holes on the ship, and they just sent you down there, and you just went on the deck. And you picked out a spot, and that was it. Excepting somebody came by and said, "It's time to get some food." And he says, "So great. What do we use? We take out our mess kits?" "No, well, you don't need your mess kit." Somehow. But he says, "You see this the steel bucket hanging on the post?" I says, "Yeah." "And there's a ladle on it?" "Yeah." "Okay. Well, take that and follow me." So I think it was 2 of us that decided to do this, because it was something to do, and you would see something, you know. While you were taking this tour to Europe, I mean, you might as well do as much as you can, right? So we went up on deck, walked across the deck, then went down into another hole, and they had a big bucket there, and it was, I guess it was oatmeal. And the guy reached into the bucket and boom, and filled this up, you know. And you carted this back up, and you went back to the hole where you were, and you brought it down. Also, he also gave us some bread, like French bread, you know, if I remember. And set this bucket down and said to the rest of them, he said, well, there it is. There's your supper, or whatever time of the day it was. I've forgotten now. I said, I guess you break out your mess kit. You want to put it in the mess kit, you know, and eat it. That's up to you. And broke up the bread. And I think I made a taste of it. I took some of it myself, and then I tasted the bread. And unfortunately, the way that oatmeal tasted, the way the bread tasted, is the way the ship stunk. It was that bad. Bad deal. Not going to eat any of this. So we had some K rations, and I think we maybe broke out a K ration. You weren't supposed to break out the K ration until you got to France, and the reason why they gave you the K ration, in case things weren't set up in France, you know, to feed you. But we broke up the ration and ate the crackers or the cheese or whatever was in a particular type, whether it was breakfast, lunch, dinner, you know. And then we found out that they had a PX on the ship, so we went up there to see what they had, and you know, run by, you know, the English and the crew, and they had some crackers, of course everything made in England, and they had some hard candy, and they had some tobacco and so forth like that. So we bought some of that. And went down back into the hole of the ship and stretched out on the floor and went to sleep for a while. And somebody else came, because we didn't go out in a 24-hour period. We were there about to move whenever they said, I guess, you know, from higher headquarters, because I think it was the following day. Somebody came in, and I was picked. I don't know why. I'm no longer an acting gadget. You know, I lost that status when I left the country. And took me out and down the gangplank and said, you know, watch the gangplank and don't let anybody up and don't let anybody off. I did it all by myself. You know. I think that was it. So there was nothing going on, nothing around, nobody creeping or crawling. But a captain came by eventually, and he was a paratroop captain, told by his uniform, told by his boots. And he said to me, what are you doing out here? And I said, well, I'm supposed to watch and see that nobody gets aboard and nobody comes off the ship. So he says, all by yourself? And I said, yeah, there's nobody else around. Only one way you can go and come unless you want to jump in the water or something. And so he said, well, he says, I'm down here for a different reason. You know, of course, I asked him, you know, you want to go aboard or something, sir? You know, and he said, no. But he said to me, he said, would you like some donuts? So I said, sure. I'd like to have some donuts. And he says to me, well, then come along. I said, where are we going? He says, right in the warehouse on the pier, right across over here. So I said, yeah, okay, I guess so. You know, trusting. But I left my post in effect, right? Didn't give that too much of a thought, really. And we went into this warehouse, and there is tons of donuts that have already been cooked. And it's cold, you know, and he pulls out a tray and he says, here. He says, you can take these back to the ship you want, you know. So I went back to the ship with the donuts, and I went right up the gangway, went to the hole, you know, and I called down, and I said, leaned over with the trays, of donuts and handed them down. I said, here's a gift, The captain gave them to me on a pier. And, I don't think I was ever relieved from that detail. I don't think anybody ever bothered with it after that. And that was, a weird thing, He went his way and I went mine, And it finally, in late afternoon, they pulled away and we started out into the channel and arrived in Le Havre maybe 11 o'clock at night or something like that. And they had, by that time, they had a steel floating pier and a ship could actually pull in alongside of it. 4 ships could pull in, not big monsters, but fair-sized cargo ships. And that was the beach near Le Havre, France. And that was an interesting movement getting off the ship because it went almost straight down. The gangway, went almost straight down like this. And of course, you're loaded up with the barracks bag, the weapons, the web equipment, the overcoat, the field jackets, and everything that you owned. And blankets, you're somewhere along the line there, we got extra blankets. So you had 4 blankets and an extra pair of shoes. They had issued combat boots. And you had tied those on the back of your pack, and that thing was swinging in the breeze. And we had been issued from old style, what we called old style packs that dated back, to 1918 into the new packs, where you could, it was like a box, you could shape it because it had straps a number of different ways, and you had a separate packages on top, which that zipped on and zipped off, and you could use that as a separate carrying bag too. And you could carry a tremendous amount of equipment there. So we're carrying 50 pounds plus at that time. Plus, got to handle this and keep the M1 on your shoulder and get down this all by yourself. One at a time. And when anybody fell, it was like dominoes. One guy after the other would go. But they weren't too much worried about that. But there were slats, where you could catch your heel of the boot, and if you didn't, there might be some slipping. And there had been stories that I heard where people, slipped through the rail and wound in the drink. Not only there, but in New York, when they were loading aboard ship. And from there, that we marched about 3 miles into the heights. Outside of Le Havre into a camp. Nicely mudded. They had steel matting down that they used, like in the airstrips. There was steel matting down, and there were tents set up, which we used to call squad tent, and that was it. You went in a squad tent, threw your equipment on the ground, and picked out a space and went to sleep. It was cold, it was damp, and pretty muddy, and we were pretty tired. And I remember maybe 7 o'clock the next morning or something, Some people fell out on that march because you could feel it being inactive for almost 3 to 4 weeks after you stopped your basic training. So now you weren't out, moving around as much and so forth. And I remember hearing every once in a while as we went up the cobblestone street up to the top, you'd hear somebody go plop. They knew, and you'd hear the steel helmets, bouncing off the concrete because you knew somebody fell out. But that wasn't much of your problem. You just kept right on going, So stayed up in that campground maybe 2 days or so. And there was nothing to do. Nobody bothered you or anything. It was just that you were there and they were just waiting to ship you out, that's all. And finally we did get a, I don't know whether it was a hello and a welcome and a goodbye all at the same time by some officer who stood up on a stump of a tree and told us, you know, where we were going and what the situation seemed to be like and so forth, and good luck and good hunting and so forth. And they marched us back down into Le Havre, and we went to the railhead. And they told us in the daylight now, there'll be a lot of Frenchmen watching you on the streets. They won't be cheering. They won't be waving any flags, and don't make eye contact with them. So we said, why not? This is because they really don't like us that much. We've moved in here and we bombed their harbors and villages, and they have a problem understanding this thing totally and completely. I said, great, you know. Well, we went down there, and then we were like cattle in a pen. And finally, they started loading us aboard freight cars. And meanwhile, searching around the yard before, well, maybe it was after we had been assigned a car, a particular car. And when I say we, this buddy of mine, we're always together. And we said, well, Ed, let's go down and wander around the yard before this thing pulls out and see if we can use anything before we go. So we found a trainman's shack, a small shack, you know, and so forth, and it had a small stove in it, and had some wicker baskets of coal. And Ed looked at me, and I looked at him, and then some other guys came along that might have had the same thing on their mind, but we knew them, and they were in our car also. And so we took the stove and took the coal and went back to the car with it, and put it in our car. And then when that happened, at the same time the train started to pull out. We didn't know that, but I mean the timing was just perfect. And we got aboard, and then we could see somebody down there at the shack going out of their mind, because he came back from whatever he did, you know. He was only a civilian working the yard. He wasn't in the army. He was a Frenchman that worked in the yards, you know. So, and he realized he was missing something in his shack and so forth, and we could see him, you know, waving his arms and screaming and so forth and everything, but we were pulling out. And then we set the stove up and chopped a hole in the roof of the car, put this pipe up through. And what that wasn't all very keen, because later on that night we damn near burned the car down. we set up a watch list amongst all the bodies in the car, which was about 25. This was much better than as when they carried, you know, prisoners of war, and the Germans, when the Germans used the cars that way, or they carried all those people that were going to the death camps, you know, they put 50 in, or better, you know. So we had 25. And you just pick out, again, you always picked out a spot, right? Like a dog, you turned around twice and it fell down. And with all your equipment and so forth, and if you wanted to eat your K ration or something, you could eat. And they closed the doors, you know, so you didn't know what was going on. It was pitch black outside, but we fired up this stove. And I remember after I had pulled my watch, and I went over into the corner of the car, and I got down. And it wasn't easy to fall off to sleep because you had this motion going back and forth, and a rocking and back and forth, a rocking, and you couldn't push yourself on the wall to steady yourself, and you couldn't grab anything on the floor. There was no way to stop this motion. So it was really it was not easy to go off to sleep, but a lot of the people did. I must have, because I woke up with a start, or somebody began to make a lot of noise, and when I did, I turned around and I see this orange glow, in the middle of the car, and obviously it had too much coal. It was burning like crazy, and there was sparks shooting around the roof of the car. So somehow, and to this day, I really don't know how we stopped all this, and how to, get the pipe down, and cool off the fire and so forth, and stop the roof from burning. But when you look back on it, actually what we were saying to the Air Force, for one thing, is here we are. If you want to know where we are, here we are. Here's the signal going up. But I think that was, I think it might have been the end of the stove bit. Because the next night we didn't have it. We maybe traded it off or put it on the siding or someplace, I don't know. And it was getting colder and colder out, because as we moved across France, the weather was changing quite a bit, and the snow began to appear on the ground, and then we could see it was mounding up as you went forward. Each village had more snow than the previous village, and so forth. And they fed us on the way, where we'd stop in a station like Barley Deuce, and they had a system in the middle of this wasn't a big station. This was just a small station in a town on ground, and the transportation corps, who was responsible to see that you got from A to B and all that, was handling this, the same as they did like on a ship. That was all handled by the transportation corps. And they actually had paper plates, I think, for us, and utensils and so forth. They fed us a hot meal, and that was like a plus. And then I remember in another town, we just try to gauge how long you were going to be there, and we would walk around to look at the village a little bit and still have the train in sight. And we're looking in one town, looking in a bakery window, and it was just French bread in the window. And I don't know whether we were debating to go in and maybe buy a loaf or what. And a little old woman ran up to us and had a loaf of bread, and she just looked at us, broke it in half, gave us one half, and ran away. We'd say, lady, we don't need this, we don't need this. We're gone as quick as she was there. And then another place, I remember we had to walk up some steps, and we found a place that looked like a cafe, and we stopped in, and it looked very makeshift, and there was a ton of GIs in there, not from the train so much. They looked like they were stationed there or whatever. And I remember there were a number of paratroopers in there. There was a paratroop officer in there, and everybody was sort of mingled together, and they were having wine and whatever, cognac, I guess, and so forth. And we pop in, and this officer turned around and said, where are you from? I said, well, we just got off the train down there. We're waiting to go through. He says, oh, you're pushing on up ahead. Yeah, we're pushing on up ahead. So he said, have a drink. He bought us a couple of drinks, wished us well, and we went on our way. As I said to Ed, hey, Europe's not bad, the trip is looking up, you know. So the next thing you know, we heard the whistle in town, and we were ready to race back down the stairs, you know. And they began to move out, but we remembered, you know, the number of your car, and we were running alongside and jumped up into the car and took off. And eventually we went around Paris, and well, there was limited, you know, rail lines to travel by because they all had been pretty well banged up, and they could only use so much for, you know, freight traffic, troop traffic, and things like that. And getting over bridges, the existing bridges, a lot of times there was backing up on sidings at night, you know, and then being pulled out again, and then traveling short distances and stopping. Everything was blackout, you know, the whole thing. There were no lights, you know, on the locomotive or anything. That's another thing we did going across. It had it had rain, and we got wet because we were off the train. So on the way back to the train, I said to my friend, I said, I'm not going back in the car soaking wet like this. I said, but let's go up to the locomotive and dry off. So we went up ahead of the train and got on the locomotive in the engineer's cab, and we went up there and shoveled some coal into the boiler and dried off. And we waited until the next stop. And we got off and walked back, you know, and the guys asked, well, where were you fellas? You know, I said, we were up in the locomotive, riding across. We helped them shovel coal into the boiler. And then we arrived in somewhere in the vicinity of Epinal, France, and the Alsace-Lorraine territory. And we were in a replacement depot. And the snow was now really high, like hip high. And it was snowing. There was a blizzard going on, and they told us that this had been going on for quite a while, and might as well get used to it. So they had nothing for us to do in particular. We still had our same issue of weapons, and the people that didn't have one, they got a nice present of a brand new weapon that was full of cosmoline, and they had to haul it off to a place they had for cleaning this sort of thing. The only other thing they did was take us out to the 1,000-inch range to zero in our weapon, and we did that. And then you lock that sight at 300 yards, a battle sight, and they had some place there that they called Radio City, and we heard that the Gray Ladies or somebody, French ladies or whatever, they ran this little club, and this was actually a factory complex, you know, but it had been taken over to quarter troops. I mean, quarter and a lot of troops that were either going or coming, and most of them were going. Or I should say coming. And we called out 3 different times up there and turned back 3 different times because they would only call off so many people. But everybody, it seemed, had to go. I don't know why, but everybody used to have to drag all your equipment with you and so forth out and stand in the snow. And if you weren't going, you went back to the factory building again and find your canvas cot. And sleeping, you slept with all your clothing on, and it was very cold. And I remember there we finally put the overcoat on over the field jacket. That's how cold it was. So that went on for about 3 days, I think, and finally, you got aboard trucks I guess they were, the 2.5-ton cargo type vehicles. And they started on a long, winding trip. I remember after we got aboard, somebody came around and threw up into the back of the truck. I guess there were K rations. And they just came by and, here's lunch. And break open the case of rations, and hand them out to people. And this thing kept winding and winding up the hills and down hills, and it looked pretty dangerous, for a driver, going through this. And of course, I don't know how they knew where they were going. I mean, people had to learn roads, and real quick, and what villages and towns it was supposed to take people to. And it was snowing all this time. It was really coming. There was a lot of evergreen around, and we were pretty high up, I suppose, in the Vosges Mountains surrounding the area. And finally arrived at some village, some French village, where somebody said, "Okay, get out of here." We jumped out of the truck, stood on the ground. There was somebody else there that I later found out that was from the 12th Armored Division. And they were an assembly point, and picked up X number of bodies and went down to another headquarters someplace. And these were all peasant villages now, small villages, and in the dead of night, assigned to a particular company. I didn't know, really where I was. I didn't know it was a 12th Armored Division, and I didn't know what battalion. I didn't know what company. That came very slow, as you began to meet a few people, and finally meet a first sergeant, and finally meet a company commander, and then get a particular assignment. And I remember a grouping in a small room. Oh yeah. Well, there seemed to be some activity going on. That's right. Before that, gets days get one before the other here, but which you heard about, all about the Herlesheim experience and so forth. Well, this unit, battalion, was beginning to pull back, from that. There was a lot of traffic, going on in the area. So as we arrived, that's right, but before that, as we arrived, we were sort of like put in with a group that was sort of guarding a retreat situation. So I said, the first thing I said to my friend McGar, I said, "This is great, they're retreating, and we just arrived, So that went over for about, I think, one night. And eventually we wound up seeing this first sergeant and seeing the captain of the company. And sitting on the floor. And they said, way we're going to do this, we need X number of people that can handle this weapon, that weapon, the other weapon, and so forth. And if you can do that, just raise your hand. If there's more than one or two or three of you that can do it, get off the floor, and the first guys that reach my desk over here will get the assignment. I don't know, are they crazy? But anyway, I sat there and I listened to M1 rifle, machine gunner, and mortarman, and I didn't pick any of them. And then I heard 57 millimeter anti-tank weapon. I got up there just ahead of another guy, and the first sergeant, the captain, says, "Okay, anti-tank weapon, 57 millimeter, you know about that?" I said, "Sure do. Never saw one in my life before." And it sounded like a decent-sized weapon where, people wouldn't necessarily, be on top of the line, like a rifleman, a mortarman, and so forth, right? Machine gunners. And I said, okay, and Sergeant so-and-so, here's a man for you, and picked me up, took me down to a schoolhouse where they were quartered, and I was in the anti-tank platoon in Company B, the 66 AIB. And everybody welcomed me because I was a new warm body, and they needed a number of them, right? So, I don't know, we were in that building maybe a couple of days. And I think some of the first shots that I heard artillery go off occasionally. But the one that really got me out of the sack was about 2 o'clock in the morning. Somebody had gotten me a sleeping bag, meanwhile. And they had straw on the floor in this schoolhouse. They had moved, the desks out and everything, and the straw was on the floor. And you could take your shoes off. And heard this, loud reports, real cracking, loud report, one after the other, and you just come bolt up, and I didn't know was that incoming or outgoing. And somebody said, "Oh, there got a crazy Frenchman again." And they said, "Well, what's that?" I said, "Well, right short distance down at an open field," he says, "they have batteries of 75 millimeter weapons down there. And every once in a while, and usually it's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, you never know when it's going to be, they get a firing order. And all it takes is for each one of the 3 guns is maybe fire 1 round or 2 rounds apiece." He says it's all over when it starts, and it's all over like that, and you won't hear them again. So that's what that is, and I think that was the first weapon that I heard fired, in a combat situation, But they stayed there. The Frenchmen stayed there, and I never saw them move around. And then we went out on what I guess sort of like what they call picket duty on our posts. We would take the guns out to crossroads and set them up in a defensive position. And then, of course, I was introduced to the half-track. I carried all your necessary equipment. And the other thing was that I was stripped of all the stuff that I had been carrying from the States, because I no longer needed the big combat pack, or not the combat pack, but I mean the sack, that you backpack that you carried everything. I could keep my weapon, keep my web equipment. It took the overcoat away. It took my barracks bag away. I took my duffel bag away. Not that I had much in it, left in it. And it gave me, I had my combat boots, and they gave me special fatigues then that were impregnated for defense against gas. And they gave me a sleeping bag, and I kept 2 blankets and a sleeping bag cover and a seat cushion, and that was for your cushion in the track. That was what you sat on, and it zipped around, and you kept extra socks and underwear in there, cards from home, whatever you wanted, really. And then you had your helmet liner, and you had your beanie, and you had your sweater, and extra ODs. And then eventually we switched strictly to OD clothing from the fatigue clothing. And your field jacket. And eventually, later on, I had a tanker jacket. And eventually, I had waterproof coveralls that were blanket lined. And eventually, from the combat boots, which you kept, but switched over to shoe packs. The rubber bottoms and leather uppers, and they had a big, thick sole in it, so you could get around in the snow. Of course, other than that, you had overshoes, that buckled over your boots, and you couldn't get out of your own way. I mean, trying to run with something like that. And that happened, many a time where a position would be attacked and people had to get out, but you couldn't run it was hampering you, actually. So they used to just take them off and leave them, and hightail out of a hot situation. With the shoe packs, I mean, you could work it out pretty well all around. And I was introduced, as I said, to the half track and to the 57 millimeter that they towed on the back. And in the half track, you had 100 rounds of 57 ammunition. I had 12 6-pound landmines on the racks outside. You had at least 2 to 3 boxes of 50 caliber ammunition because the vehicle had a 50 caliber machine gun on it. You had 2 to 3 boxes of 30 caliber ammunition for the M1 rifles. You had carbine ammunition on the track, and you had 45 ammunition also, because we also had what they call the machine gun, the grease gun. So if anything ever hit that thing, it would have been like 4th of July for the next 10 years, when they were hit, this is the way they went up, even sometimes more fiercely than a Sherman tank would go up when they got hit. And we had what the pioneer tools on the track also, shovels, axes, and so forth. And of course, that was for in case you ever had to, knock down something that was in your way. That would help and build things too. We had a lot of chains on the track. We had a cable, a steel cable winch on the front of the track, and that was used sometimes in a situation where you could pull yourself out of a ditch. And landmine detector was on there, and you carried a case of C rations and probably a case of K rations. And it depended upon whatever orders were issued, whether you were going to eat the C rations or the K rations, and that used to be determined by somebody, the captain or whatever, would tell the NCO, platoon sergeants and so forth, what to eat and what not to eat, So, and well, this kind of activity took off a number of nights around that period. It was in January, and fortunately nothing serious happened. There used to be like hurry up calls, emergency situations. You only would be told that there was some intelligence of fear of maybe a possible breakthrough in a certain area, and that's the reason why you were being sent there. A lot of times this was not particularly behind your own infantry. It was behind maybe another infantry unit from some other division, but we were like a secondary and guarding a crossroad, And that would go on every so often. And during the day there was some training in that what they used to do was after action type of thing. After a previous action, lessons learned. And they would sometimes even go back to the town that they actually fought the initial activity, and that could have only been a short distance away. You were always in close proximity to that front, and what was the front was only taken a couple of days ago, so and consolidated and so forth. So the companies could be taken back, and the whole battalions would be taken back, and they would say, okay, now we're going to take this place all over again, and we're going to show what we consider, mistakes that were made. And you kept your ears open to this, which was a lot of good information. Like one simple thing, when you would hit the ground, make sure you hit the ground close in to the building as possible, because the tile roof would be coming off, and if you were out and that tile is falling 2 stories or so, and it would cause great injury, let alone kill you, And also being careful with your weapon, which you were told in basic training and all that. But I mean, there were certain things that they noticed that individuals were maybe missing, forgetting and so forth. You were taken all through that again. And it would go on for a whole day. And at least it broke up the monotony, because, you're beginning to feel what it was to be in a monotonous situation. Because eventually, as time goes on, you're not quite sure what the day is, and you're not quite sure what the time is, because it doesn't mean a damn thing to you. Not really. If you want to think about it, I mean, you're fine, But I mean, when you didn't wake up today and say what day it is, or hooray, it's Tuesday, or going to luncheon today at 12. And in a way, I forgot. I asked somebody, today's Saturday or Sunday? No, I think it's Monday. And really, and you had this overcast constantly. There were gray days. We weren't looking at the sun. And maybe it snowed the night before. Maybe there was a little break, in the sun in the morning. But then it would be a gloom day again. So if you're in that type of situation, it's like being in a cell, And you just went through the motions. If somebody said, "Well, we're going here," go there, and do whatever you were ordered to do.
Let's go ahead and take a break right now.
Why not?
Is that all right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
I'm ready for a break. I mean,
back with Mr. McCarthy. This is August 30th, 1997. My name is Michelle Colvin, and we are in Columbus, Ohio, with the 12th Armored Division reunion, continuing a interview. Go ahead.
It was around the first of February that there was a lot of refitting of equipment and restocking of equipment on the track, and maintenance on the vehicle and things like that nature. And then I guess there was an order received to stand by and to move out. It's like move out on 12 hours notice or move out on 2 hours notice. It could be anything. So you were going to stay right exactly where you were, whatever building, whatever town we were in at that particular time. And then as it became dark that night, the convoy started to move out. Everything was on the road. I found out, that I belonged to a Combat Command A, and nobody really knew, I don't think off the top, that the mission was going to be to seal, or at least, help to be seal off the Colmar pocket. The Germans had been cut off there for many months, especially when the Battle of the Bulge happened, and the Third Army had moved north a bit, and the Seventh Army took over Two Army Front. And the big picture, was for the Seventh Army to hold, mainly what they call holding attacks. And it keeps everybody on the other side off balance. And at the same time, General Eisenhower had ordered that the Colmar pocket be eliminated. So we were placed under French First Army tactical supervision, and would be committed based on the French general's order. So we were moving at night, or CCA and CCB, CCR, the Division Artillery, was being placed into position and following on. And by the nightfall, we were actually moving into the outskirts of Colmar. Meanwhile, the 28th Infantry and the 79th, I think, and the 3rd Infantry and so forth, they were working up in the hills and many other areas, having their hands full to a certain extent, and the French 2nd Armored Division was also in the area, and the rest of the French infantry, French Moroccans were involved. However, we received an order, that is, the division as a whole had received an order to move through as rapidly as possible and to hit the town of Rouffach in southern France. It's the opposite side of Colmar. And in doing so, we would seal off the exit, the last exit, for them to get out, and which we did. And it was for us at that time, it was just a race to get there, and if anything was in the way or spotted, it was eliminated. Not much of that actually happened. We were fortunate. Some of the units and the other combat commands did run into crossroads situations and roadblocks and things that had to be eliminated. And we arrived in Rouffach. It was very early in the morning, and the Germans were racing up into the hills to get away, and they were racing out of town. They were trying to, get away as many as possible. Some of them had pretty good warning, and did get out of that loop, but I don't know how far they got. They ran into somebody else that was preventing them, but nobody else left that area after we had sealed it off. And then the mission was to patrol up into the foothills of the Vosges Mountains, and that meant going out mostly every night, and one squad patrol. That one squad for us would be maybe 8, maybe be 7. It just depended upon how many we had. Because I was in an anti-tank platoon, and the anti-tank platoon is not like a rifle platoon. We're only 29 people when we're full strength. And that's a gun crew for each weapon. So, but they usually utilize us the same as they would an infantry platoon many a time. They had 48 people. So we would go out up into the hills and at nighttime, and sometimes we were lucky not to run into a patrol, if you want to, a German patrol, because there were some that were trying to infiltrate out. Some of them were ready to give up, but most of the times they're ready to give up. They came down during the daytime, but the first night they tried to come down in our particular area, and they didn't make it. So this went on up until about the 5th of February. And there wasn't much for us to do during the daytime. We were living down in the town itself, right in the heart of the town almost. So, and we had been billeted in what had been probably some German official home, because all of their clothing, everything was still there. And it was a fairly nice apartment, but so it made it nice for us, So in that, instead of sleeping on the bare floor, you slept on a rug, with seat cushions, from the chairs and things like that, which they had a habit of doing in furnishing the house, with a lot of cushions around and so forth. And we only then stayed a short time, but enough to run into French-Moroccan soldiers and traded off our rations for their sardines. So they had, and that was a treat, sort of, and they wanted our rations, and of course, always cigarettes and things like that, But we, picked up some. They seemed to be having had a good number of bottles of wine with them. We always, and the French and so forth. And they were willing to part with it. I mean, if we had something to trade, And they were very interesting in that the way they operated, mostly at night. You had to be careful, that you didn't run into them at night. You had to hope that they would recognize you and so forth. If you were on the ground, a lot of times you wouldn't know that they were there, but of course they would crawl up, and the next thing you know, you might hear, "Okay, Joe," which meant that he touched the buckles on your shoes, on your boots, because the Germans didn't have buckles on their boots. So if they didn't feel the buckle, that was the end of you. But if they knew what the GI buckles felt like on the boots, and then they would crawl off in the night. But all you heard was, "Okay, Joe," and they were gone. So that was interesting.
How did you handle the stress during those times? That's got to be anxiety-ridden.
I don't know. I don't know whether we really felt it as stress. It was always, I think it was more stressful going out, getting, ready, to do whatever you were supposed to do. And then, once you got more into the mission, it's more that you were zeroed. You were zeroed in your mind and so forth, and keeping in touch with who was around you. Just by sight. And your mind was really taken off, as far as I was concerned. Of stress. You didn't know it until you were returning and nothing else was going on, and that you accomplished your mission for that night and so forth. And of course, I guess maybe it was capable of handling. If that was stress, then you're probably capable of handling the stress a little bit better, because now you knew you were coming back to your little apartment, and maybe heat up some coffee or cocoa or a biscuit or maybe a bottle of cognac, And it was the same way all the time. There was occasions when It sounded like it was going to be, because you didn't arrive in the sector yet, but it sounded like that it was a real good show going on, in that a town was not being taken too easily. And I think a little more about that one coming up, because you could see things burning, you could see the houses, going up, and you could see point-blank direct fire going on, and you had to prepare yourself and go into this thing. And then the next thing you know, the word came down the road. We were probably just on the side of the road, just waiting, because you were just out of range of everything else that's been going on. And then it was like called in, and you got up and you went in. I mean, that was like the unknown, all the time to me. What at the book, The Other Side of Time, and the troops entering through the smoke. They were going into the unknown, sort of thing. Knowing what you would do, pretty good idea how you would react, depending upon the situation. And of course, that all had to be split-second thing. I mean, this is what's going on, this is what you do. People knew how to dovetail one another in a team if that was necessary. You saw this happened here, or you moved away from it, you tried to get under, or whatever, over, in between. The order might have been, clear the houses. It meant going in there and clearing them, that's all. Whoever was there, and hope that you weren't going to receive too much fire. You didn't know when it was going to happen, or how it was going to happen, or if there was a sniper in the place, it's down the block, or things like that. You never know. And then could be incoming mortar fire in the street, and everybody would try to get out from under, and then picked up as soon as it lifted, and you moved on, you pushed on. It was always forward, was the not the password, it's the doctrine sort of thing. Always forward. And that's what leadership had to do, and always keep in their mind. Never bog down if you don't have to. Keep moving. And of course, you had to be prepared if a sergeant was wounded or eliminated, and a corporal all of a sudden was taken out of the picture. I mean, generally, everybody knew who the next senior man was. If somebody did not have the, I don't know what you would say, the presence of mind, to pick it up, somebody else would say, okay, follow me. And after that, we came back, I think we came back to Loonville. I always get them mixed up between St. Avold and Loonville. And we were back then under, I think, placed in reserve under Schaeff Army Headquarters. We were in Theater Army Reserve, which meant we weren't in direct supervision of 7th Army. We were under, we'll put it this way, General Eisenhower's command. And he always had a division, 2 or 3 divisions in reserve. And that's just following doctrine, where a battalion would always keep a company in reserve. A division would always keep another whole battalion in reserve. The thing was always 2 up and 1 back. So we're playing Army and Corps. So we have whatever is up on the line, and he has whatever he needs. He figures if he gets a hurry call on something from a Army commander, he has a whole division to say, okay, shoot them down there. So we were staying within close proximity of the actual activity, and it wound up that we were kept out of the line for almost, I guess it was 2 weeks at that time. The Division Artillery never left a firing mission, though, but the infantry organizations were off the line. The tank battalions were pretty much off the line. And there again, the order might be to go out, and block main intersections. And this meant that could be way out in a desolate area when you know what the West is like. I mean, a road goes this way, another one goes that way, but you don't see anything, and that's the way this was. And we take a whole platoon out, take the track out, and keep the track parked a pretty good distance from the intersection, and set the gun up almost at the intersection, and then the squad would just stand by, around it and pull like a 2-hour tour of doing that. And then another squad would come down and relieve you, and then you could go back to the track. And we went back to the track, we had the canvas on and it was zipped up, and in there we had a little stove, a gasoline stove, like you use in a camping, the Coleman stove. And or somebody that was back, well, a driver was generally back with the track, and he might have it going, and hot water, and then you could, warm up, because it's pretty cold at this point. We moved now from the south a bit north, not too much, but enough that you were going back with some snow on the ground, and it was cold, and some nights a lot of wind blowing through. So, and you were wearing, everything you could practically get your hands on, to stay warm. And it's because when you were in the track, the steel floor of the track, was ice cold. And it came right through, so you're always hanging your boots, and so forth, and playing a tap dance there. So, but at least you felt that you were in out of the elements, going on. And then that would go on all night until you could go back to the French barracks that we were living in at that time.
Okay. Why don't we go ahead and stop now and put a new tape in, since we've run out of tape on this one.